not only did this hero's journey resonate just with a desire we might all have, it actually, for me, it felt like it told the story of the life I was living. And I think I realized that it wasn't a one-time adventure. It had the potential for me to be a pattern or a framework that I could lean into and try to follow over and over again in order to find more meaning, more purpose, and more transformation in my life. And so it was, in many ways, what I was missing back in Virginia, and what I realized was offering me a pathway, almost like a guidepost on the journey that could deliver the things I wanted more in life, which was meaning and purpose and significance.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. Boredom, confusion, aimlessness, lack of purpose, lack of fulfillment, and a host of other emotional and psychological woes. These are some of the problems that, though they're not entirely new to humanity, seem especially rampant in the affluent Western world today. You might even be able to relate to one or two of them yourself. When the modern age doesn't offer many useful remedies to these ills, where else can we look? It's time to return to the old roads, to quote a line from an Andrew Peterson song. It's time to return to wisdom that has been generated over generations and stood the test of time. It's this wisdom that my longtime friend and colleague, Jon Ritner, and I unpack together in this episode through the lenses of our own stories. It's the wisdom contained in the hero's journey, a compass for living derived, surprisingly enough, from humankind's core mythologies. In this episode, you'll get a crash course in the hero's journey and an introduction to how to begin using it in your own life right now to vanquish the dragons of boredom, confusion, aimlessness, lack of purpose, lack of fulfillment, and the laundry list of other besetting woes. As you vanquish those dragons, you'll discover the treasure behind them that you were uniquely meant to find and share with the world. If you're willing, you're in for the adventure of your life. This episode is also an appetizer for the main course that Jon and I will serve up this October at a special one-day event designed to fully equip you to use the hero's journey in your own life. More about that in today's conversation. Jon Ritner and I met in college in the early 90s. We were acquaintances then, but became close friends in the years immediately following college, when we were roommates, each of us trying to find ourselves and find our way. We ended up on the same church staff together, a chapter in our stories full of highs and lows and lessons hard won. We've seen each other at our best, and we've seen each other at our worst. Eventually, our paths diverged, and that's the point at which we pick up Jon's story today. Jon has served as a pastor for 20 years in various capacities in the U.S. and overseas. Today, he's the Chief Strategy Officer for Communitas International, a global nonprofit. He also coaches leaders who are starting and shaping communities to live like Jesus, and the author of Positively Irritating, a philosophical and practical guide for faith leaders navigating the changing cultural realities in the Western world. Jon and Kristen, his wife of 22 years, live in Burbank, California, with their teenage son and daughter. Without further ado, it's a true pleasure to introduce you to Jon and the hero's journey. Jon, our paths diverged after working together in Williamsburg for about a decade when you left me without my permission and went to Europe with your family. What led to such a big move?
Yeah, those were great days, being on staff together in Williamsburg and starting our marriages and families together. You know, honestly, I look back on that time and I realized that in many ways I was kind of living the American dream. I had this comfortable suburban life. My wife and I had bought the 4-bedroom apartment with an acre of land and, 2,000 square feet. And we could afford that with a successful job. And I was kind of climbing the ladder in the world that I was in, which was the church world, working for a local church that was growing and thriving. And my wife always joked she had the minivan dream that she wanted, and it was everything that, you might grow up thinking was going to make you happy in life. And at about year 9 or 10, I started realizing that while I had all this external success, there was something internally within my own soul that was not resonating. There was something about this lifestyle that was even kind of killing my soul. And as I reflected on it and thought about it.
I got a question for you. You're on a roll, but I got a question for you.
Yeah.
You sort of describe an experience of your soul that something wasn't quite right, but what were some of the indicators to you that that was the case?
I think one was a lot of my life up to that point, I had been inspired by serving others and caring for others, even the spirit of generosity. I remember one day thinking about kind of wanting to live out a posture of generosity in life. And I had grabbed a $20 bill from my dresser and put it in my pocket. And I thought, man, I want to find, someone that I can serve today with $20. And literally going through my entire day and realizing there's not one person around me in my suburban kind of curated life that has any financial needs that $20 would be a blessing for. And I was like, that doesn't feel right. I mean, that's not, how did I end up in an environment like this? Part of it also was there was very little risk. There was no sense of adventure. My early years of becoming a person of faith and deciding I wanted to be a follower of Jesus included a lot of risk and adventure and personal cost, and all that was gone. And in its place of like that sense of adventure was becoming kind of an egomaniacal sense of wanting to build my own empire and wanting to ascend to the throne of this, job and career that I had chosen. And I just knew that wasn't who I wanted to be. And so I didn't know what to do with it, but I just kind of knew something was missing. And in the midst of that, I had what for me was kind of a spiritual awakening moment where I was hearing a friend of mine speak about serving the post-Christian world or the secular world of Europe and how they were engaging in charities and nonprofit work and how they were helping people of faith kind of contemplate how to express their faith in Jesus in a world that did not share that faith. And I kind of heard this voice that I ultimately attribute to God of saying, what if you could go to the future and experience the way that American culture is moving and learn about what that culture is going to be like, experiment in it, and then come back to America and help prepare others for the culture that's coming. And it felt like a call to adventure in many ways. And over the next couple months, I couldn't get that thought out of my head. I realized it was going to come with a lot of cost and risk. And there were days in which my wife and I thought, no, this is dumb. We have 2 young kids. They're 4 and 6. Why would we want to give up this great cushy job and this great home to move over to some apartment in Europe and have to learn a new language and all that? But eventually we decided, you know what, we think this is kind of the path that we're being invited into, and it's a path that actually excites us. We decided to rent our apartment and took our kids out of school and moved over to Brussels, Belgium, and lived there for 3 years, working for a nonprofit called Serve the City that helped work with asylum seekers and refugees and elderly and children in need. And then we also kind of helped care for small faith communities in the city there that were gathering in numbers of anywhere from 15 to 25 or so to learn the way of Jesus. And we spent 3 years there, and it was really life-changing. There was so much growth and transformation, so much family bonding. My marriage got stronger. My family got stronger. At the end of those 3 years, we decided that the end of this journey was what we had heard from the beginning, which was to go back to the U.S. and share some of the lessons and frameworks and paradigms that we were learning about this new culture with anyone who would be interested in learning it and anyone who was kind of open to hearing about the future that we believed was really coming to America, which is kind of often how Western culture has been, that Europe tends to be the future of America in terms of fashion and trends and, cultural reality. So that, kind of is what caused our paths to diverge. And then now we've been out in Los Angeles for 8 years. And thankfully, you and I have had a chance to reconnect here on the West Coast, both of us being so far away from where we first met.
There's a part of your story you've shared with me before that occurred during an elders meeting when the initial seed of this idea grabbed hold of you. Will you share what happened and what you did in that moment that catalyzed the adventure? Because it was a pivotal moment as you've described it to me.
I think what you're referring to is what I often think of as the 10-second principle. I heard this individual, Carlton was his name, sharing about life in Europe. And when I first had this call to adventure, this sense of, I think it would be exciting to go learn from him. I had a voice that came to my mind. It came from a book that I had just read called The 10-Second Principle. And the 10-Second Principle, written by a man of faith, says that when God prompts you to something in your life, you have 10 seconds to obey before your rational brain will dismiss that prompting as being unreasonable and something that you should ignore. And so as soon as I had this image of, hey, you should go to Europe and learn and experience and then come back and help others, my next thought was, you have 10 seconds to do something with that prompting. You have 10 seconds to obey that, to receive that call, or else your brain will tell you that's the dumbest thought you've ever had. And so in that moment, in the little 10-second window, I committed to go talk to Carlton after the meeting and to call my wife and see if we could invite him over for dinner that night. And the irony is, that 10-second principle has been in my head for many years. And there are many other times where I have not obeyed in 10 seconds. And sure enough, those 10 seconds pass and you find yourself rethinking and reanalyzing and just dismissing what 10 seconds ago you thought might have actually been a moment of insight, an epiphany. All of a sudden now it feels crazy. So for me, it was such a good picture of how I felt like God had been preparing me for that moment to receive that call to adventure.
I think that's a great lesson for all of us, because many of us are somewhat predisposed to disregard or dismiss or be suspicious of those promptings, whether or not we attribute it to a higher power. I think we all have had the experience of some kind of like, ooh, that's an idea, or that calls to me. And then the moment passes, and this podcast exists because thankfully I did some version of what you're saying. I was out on a run and realized I would love to interview people in Steamboat, and because a lot of interesting people here. And as I'm on the run, knowing myself as I do, I thought, if I don't do something with this, as soon as I get done with my run, it's never going to see the light of day. So I made myself call a couple friends and schedule interviews with them. I didn't even have recording equipment or any way to capture the audio, but I knew I had to get them on the calendar. And sure enough, that led to a progression of steps that's led to the podcast existing in its current form today. So there's something magical and important about those times. And summoning the courage and the resolve to acknowledge them and act upon them is part of what I'm hearing is really the key here.
And Andrew, what's interesting is you share your version of this story. Both of us did the same thing, which was we created accountability by communicating it to another person. And even though that person had no power over us, by communicating it went public, so to speak. And then we felt that we weren't alone in this. We couldn't just dismiss it as an idea in our head. It now existed as an idea out in the world that others knew about. And therefore, it led us to want to follow through. So I think that's such an important step. When you have that idea, who can I tell so that this doesn't just pass away?
That's a great point. The idealist, the perfectionist in me, the neurotic in me also wonders, what if you have like 3 of those a week or 2 of those a day? Or one could imagine, maybe it's a little bit excessive, but you begin to accumulate all of these things that you've started and are able to manage. And again, that's a little bit of a neurosis-derived question, but what do you think about that? How do you distinguish between ones that deserve attention and ones that don't?
Yeah. Well, I think if you have a safe person who you can air these ideas out to, and that they won't judge you harshly if you decide not to follow through on them. If you have that safe person that you can say, hey, I had a crazy idea, I just have to get it out, and I'm going to take 1 or 2 steps to explore it. Will you, support me in that? And then you come back and go, yeah, I did a couple things and I think it's kind of crazy. I'm not going to do anything with it. I think the key is that you externalized it, you explored it a little bit, and not every idea you have is ultimately worth fulfilling. But if you feel the pressure that, oh my gosh, if I say it, then I'm going to have to do it or else, then you'll just stuff it anyway. Yeah, I think there's probably some kind of wisdom needed to figure out which of my crazy ideas is worth going all in on and which is worth just maybe experimenting with in small batches to find out if there's anything there. And if not, no big deal. I'll pull the plug on it and go back to my regular life, so to speak.
It really highlights the importance of having a few close, trusted relationships in your life where you can seek and receive counsel that you find reliable from people who overall have your best interest in mind. Nobody's perfect, so we're never completely altruistic or unbiased, but people we can trust. Maybe that's your partner, significant other, spouse, good friend, sibling, whoever it might be. And if you find yourself listening today and you don't have those kinds of resources, then what could you do today even to begin enlisting those resources and cultivating them? And if you don't know where to start, call somebody like me, call somebody like Jon. We'd love to talk with you through that. Jon, the other things I hear in your story is just the idea of this inner voice. Again, you talk about it as a prompting from God, and I relate very much to that. And I also attribute those promptings to God. I also attribute my inner voice to God. But I bet many of us, whether or not we would attribute it to God, can appreciate the idea of an inner voice. And I wanted to just let the listeners know I've got a whole episode on our inner voice and the importance of being able to tune into it and being able to respond to it. So to hear and to heed it, because our inner voices, I believe, speak to us the truth of our specific existences. What is our path as opposed to the 97,000 other paths one might follow in life? What are our purposes as opposed to the 97,000 other purposes that might be ours in life? I do believe that God has implanted within us a voice that speaks to us the truth of our existence. And so if any of you are wondering about that or how to cultivate that capacity to listen to your inner voice, how to tune it up and to tune the other voices down, because often what happens is other voices have taken such a dominant role in our hearts and minds that it's very difficult for us to hear our own voice. And we need, sort of like an audio engineer would bring in levels of instruments and voices, we need to figure out how to bring our inner voice more into the mix so that it has as much, if not more, say in ultimately what we do in our life. So I hope you listen to that episode. I don't remember the episode number right offhand. I can put it in the show notes. Okay, so you are now in Hollywood and you're working with writers and filmmakers, and you got introduced to this concept called the hero's journey. What is it, and what did it mean to you personally? What has it meant to you personally?
Yeah, I grew up like you as more of an athlete than an artist, and had never taken a drama class in my life. Didn't really fancy myself as, any sort of a creative writer or storyteller. And so in moving here, I thought, man, I better kind of understand this culture. And so I started reading books on acting and screenwriting and listening to podcasts. And one of the books I discovered was written by the former head of Disney filmmaking, Christopher Vogler, and it was called The Writer's Journey. And it tells the story of Disney in the 80s when they were just pumping out absolute crap movies like Benji 2, The Reckoning, and like just random stuff that you've never heard of. If you saw the movie posters even, you'd be like, wait, that's a real movie? People made that?
Are you saying Benji 2 is a crap movie? You're saying Benji 2 is a crap movie? I shouldn't like it? It's one of my favorites. But
Did you like I didn't even know there was a Benji 2.
I didn't.
And I definitely don't think it's called The Reckoning, but I think that's getting my mind.
Benji gets rabies.
It's like a Benji Cujo crossover, maybe.
Okay.
Anyway. But in the midst of him struggling, going, why are we making such crap? And how do we tell better stories? He stumbles upon this old book by Joseph Campbell called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And Joseph Campbell is kind of a sociologist, anthropologist, who is studying the mythology of ancient cultures. And one of the things that he discovers is that across every culture he can look at, Eastern, Western, Southern Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere, he ends up discovering this myth. He calls it the monomyth, like the one myth, this ultimate archetype of a hero. And he recognizes that in all these different cultures, there is a mythology of this hero going on a journey. And the stages of the journey are incredibly consistent. He ends up kind of making the point that this archetype, he believes, is kind of embedded in our soul, almost the way Carl Jung talks about archetypes that resonate within us. And that this call to adventure, this hero's journey that he ends up using that phrase, is something that each one of us resonates with and wants to experience in life. And so Christopher Vogler ends up, staying up late at night, writes this manifesto, summarizes the 12 beats of the hero's journey, and he comes in the next day to all of his screenwriters and he says, here's the deal. From now on, we're only telling one story. We're telling the story of a hero, and here is the framework for the story, and you can pick the setting, you can pick the main character, you can pick the world they live in, but this is the story you have to tell. And so within 2 years, Disney puts out their first film after this manifesto, and it's Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And it blows up. Rick Moranis, who's the weird scientist, shrinks the kids. The kids go into this other world. They eventually get rescued and returned to their normal size. And from there, they start doing Little Mermaid and Lion King and all the, eventually Pixar grows out of that and spins out. And since then, Disney has just done blockbuster movie after blockbuster movie. And this story, this hero's journey, is, I would say now, probably makes up 50% of the films that you've seen in Hollywood. There's a kind of a set pattern. There's in story writing, script writing, they call it beats, 12 beats, so to speak, that character, a main hero, goes through. And it really resonates with the average film goer or, reader who I believe finds something deep within their soul that says, I want to be on a journey just like this. And what struck me as I read this book, The Writer's Journey, and started looking more into the hero's journey was, oh my gosh, this is what I've just gone through in my trip from Virginia to Europe and now back to the US. The three main kind of phases of the hero's journey. The first phase is there's a separation phase where the hero leaves their ordinary world. They leave their home, their homeland. It's Samwise and Frodo leaving the Shire, right? And they begin to set out on an adventure where they cross over into some new unknown world. And in that unknown world, the second phase takes place where there's an initiation phase where they begin to face trials and they have challenges. They begin to meet some allies. They come across their enemies for the first time. They have some battles. They learn what they're made of, so to speak. And then eventually they have a big showdown scene. Maybe they die and then experience a form of resurrection or coming back to life or being restored. And now all of a sudden they become the conquering hero who gets to return home. And so the final phase there is the return phase, where the hero brings these new skills and insights back to their ordinary world. And the irony, of course, is that they are back home. They're back in their ordinary world, but they themselves have become extraordinary. They are not the same person, even though they're back in the same place. And so, the classic example of the final return scene is when Samwise and Frodo and their two other friends are sitting around the pub where they've been drinking and acting like total clowns in the first act. And now in the third act of the final movie, after they've conquered Mordor and they've delivered the ring, they're in that setting and everyone around them is drinking and acting like fools and singing and dancing on tables. And yet they're sitting there with a maturity and a composure as they look at each other and realize we have been transformed by the adventure we're on. So we're back in our home, but we're not the same people. We are now different. And so I realized that's exactly what I felt a call to do. I felt a call to leave my home world, to go to a new world, experience adventure, to learn some things, to be transformed, and then to come back to home, which was America, and try to offer what I had learned as a gift to those around me. And so not only did this hero's journey resonate just with a desire we might all have, it actually, for me, it felt like it told the story of the life I was living. And I think I realized that it wasn't a one-time adventure, that it had the potential for me to be a pattern or a framework that I could lean into and try to follow over and over again in order to find more meaning, more purpose, and more transformation in my life. And so it was, in many ways, what I was missing back in Virginia, and what I realized was offering me a pathway, almost like a guidepost on the journey that could deliver the things I wanted more of in life, which was meaning and purpose and significance.
So it's really this, to use an overused term, there's this meta significance to you as it helped you make more sense of your life, both in the previous chapter where you'd experienced status quo in a deadening way, in a way that was not giving you life. And then you would respond to the call to adventure and you'd been enlivened in ways that you hadn't before. It made sense of those two chapters. It kind of compared and contrasted them and then allowed you to see that, I can proactively engage this dynamic in life. I can put this to work not only for my own service, but to continue to benefit others. And you began to be refilled with a sense of adventure and purpose and like trajectory where it was lacking before. And this ancient tool is having real world contemporary benefit. It's not just an observation of the way that people have conceived of the heroes of old and how we enjoy watching them on the screen today. That myth is in fact a way of describing humanity's deepest longings, humanity's intended interaction with life in this world.
Yeah. Yes. That we were all paying $15 a ticket to go watch stories of samurais or wizards or cowboys or knights going on this adventure because we ourselves wanted to live in the same pattern, the same way. And we don't have to simply live vicariously through these epic stories of heroes we see on the big screen. We are the hero of our own story, and we have the agency, and we can be empowered to look for the adventure around us, to choose it and to lean into it. In my story, there had been a specific call to adventure that I received, but I began to realize the world is calling me to adventure all the time. There are opportunities around me all the time to go on a journey of sacrifice and transformation and, even dying to myself and my own desires, which is very much part of what a hero does. I mean, if you wonder who the hero is in a story, you just ask the question, who is sacrificing the most? That's what a hero does. A hero sacrifices the most for the benefit of others. And we have opportunities to do that all around us, in our communities, in our marriages, in our families, in our workplace. And so often when that call to adventure or that call to sacrifice is presented, we do what every hero does in the film, is we initially refuse. We initially think, I can't do it. It's too costly. It's too much. It's too disruptive. I'm going to stay in the status quo. And then often what happens in the hero's journey is that there's a mentor who comes along, a Gandalf, a Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm not a Harry Potter guy, but the Harry Potter mentor comes along as well, and that mentor helps the hero summon the courage to go forward. And both you and I kind of live now in this world of coaching and helping others. And one of the things that I think a coach is meant to do in life is to serve as that mentor who helps the hero realize you have what it takes to go on this journey. And you don't have to do it alone. I'll go with you, but you're the hero, not me. I'm just a guide in the journey. But my role is to help you find and summon the courage to cross over that threshold into this new space. And as long as you would like me to be, I'll be on this journey with you to keep reminding you of what is already inside of you and that you are enough to go on this adventure. That character shows up time and time again in stories, and oftentimes that character dies halfway through the journey, but the hero survives. The hero themselves realizes, you know what, now the mentor has played their role. They've instilled the confidence in me, and enough to the point where I now believe it, and I can move on even without that parent or that, godfather voice in my head saying, I love you and you're enough.
I love that idea of the mentor dying, not the fact that the mentor dies, but as I relate that to, the helping professions that you and I are in, the idea is that they become greater and we become less, to badly co-opt a phrase from scripture. That eventually we're not needed. I mean, we serve a purpose for a time, as you said, as someone who calls the person forth into the adventure of their life, helps them get going on the adventure of their life, maybe helps them understand what provisions are needed that maybe they haven't yet acquired for themselves. Then they provision themselves, they set off on the journey, you walk with them for a bit, and then it's like, hey man, go get after it. And that's a great example, I think, of the role that we in the helping professions are meant to serve in the lives of those that we work with.
Yeah.
I actually have a Gandalf cloak and staff in the corner of my office that I don when my clients come in. So enraptured am I of the idea of being the guy. Some of them think it's a little bit weird, but no, I don't really do that. It's not as if when you were working back at the church and sort of climbing, quote unquote, the rungs of that ladder, there wasn't an element of calling an adventure there for you too, because, this ministry calling was very clearly upon you, and one that you was providing order and structure and direction for your life. And that was, a reasonable place to explore that and try and work that out. But somehow that environment ended up being a stagnant status quo environment for you eventually. And the fruit of it was no longer satisfactory, either in terms of meaning for you or maybe even contribution in that environment. Now compare that with the next chapter that opened up with Europe and Hollywood and what you find yourself doing now. And, at least as an outside observer, I would say the fruit of that is both in terms of its impact upon you and your sense of adventure and your sense of engagement in the world in very real and tangible ways, and also its impact in the world, even if you just looked at it from the number of people you're able to reach now as opposed to the number of people you're able to reach before in your current role with Communitas. It seems to me apples and oranges when you compare the fruit. How would you compare the fruit of the first adventure that ultimately began to sort of, I've used too many words. You get the idea. You go.
Yeah. What I would say is that when I was living in that status quo world, most of the fruit of my life was being enjoyed by me. So wealth, I was consuming the fruit, and there was nothing wrong with that. It's wonderful to, reap the fruits of your labor, so to speak. But over time, I think that each of us ultimately recognized we were meant for more than to just consume our own fruit, so to speak. And that what I was lacking was the ability to share what I was learning with others, or to give away to others. One of the phrases that has become significant to me is that, my fruit grows best on other people's trees. It's a way of saying that I want to be more of a seed planter than a fruit eater. I want to be someone who inspires and instills and instructs and empowers others so their tree grows and they have fruit that, the world can see, and that the spotlight is more on them than on me. That I know I played my role, but I can empower them and equip them to become the best versions of themselves and to offer their gifts to the world around them. And then encourage them to realize that part of your gift giving is not just enjoy it yourself, but to multiply what you have into the lives of others around you. So, even that example of having $20 and not being able to give it away, that became kind of a metaphor for what I felt like I was experiencing, which was I wasn't in a position where I was being stretched and growing enough that I had something to offer others. I was too complacent to just simply soak and sit in my own accomplishments. And again, that pattern of status quo comfort and then leaning back into adventure, that's not a one-time story. And now that I'm familiar with this framework and I can see these, I literally have a diagram that I've looked at and I've taught on to kind of look at these steps, and I go, man, that happened in college. When I first decided to follow Jesus in a fraternity house. That happened after college when I decided to go into the helping profession. That happened the first time I was working at a church and they told me that I was responsible for leading all of the older men in the church. And I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't have a great relationship with my dad. I'm not great with older men. I'm insecure. I don't think I can do this. And then leaning into it and watching how that challenge actually formed me. One of the phrases that Joseph Campbell talks about in The Hero's Journey is that the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. And I think for me, that's become almost like a life mantra, that the obstacle, the cave you're afraid of, that you think will kill you, that you don't want to lean into, you don't want to face, you don't want to, head towards, that actually holds the thing that you need the most. A simple way of saying it is the obstacle is the path. You don't go around the obstacle, you take the obstacle on head on. And so what I've realized in my life is that many of the times that I've come up against something that I wanted to avoid, by actually going through it and receiving that call to adventure to take on the thing I fear the most, it's transformed me in the most significant ways. And so, yeah, I think, the journey that I've been on now is how do I keep replicating this hero's journey, this call to adventure, that leaving my ordinary world, gaining something, dying to myself, and then acquiring something I can bless and give to others. How do I just do that as often as possible so that my life becomes kind of a multiplying force that gives life to those around me?
Man, I so resonate with all of that. I mean, that's completely been my experience. We've had very different paths since our paths diverged many years ago. But, I also responded to a call to adventure and haven't looked back for one single moment. And it's been the most challenging 10 years in many ways of my life, and the best, which just highlights to me how, we use the word or the phrase status quo, and it's meant just to sort of describe things as they currently are. But I've come to see the status quo as potentially existentially threatening. I mean, really an enemy of our souls in a profound way, because the status quo kind of lulls us into, I don't know what it lulls it. It just lulls us to sleep. And if there's anything that I'm particularly interested in doing these days, it's helping us all to really wake up, not only, as is always the case, to the reality of our mortality so we can tap into its motivational power, but just to wake up to the reality of this adventure that's available to us. And I think in the affluent Western world, many of the cultural, broadly, and individual psychological, social, and emotional challenges that we face can be traced in some way back to settling into the status quo. And we'll go to a movie, and I love the word consume, because I was thinking the very same word. We'll go consume a hero's story and be enraptured by it, motivated by it, and sometimes inspired to take action. And the great stories do that. The great stories actually inspire us to take action, I think. But then we'll return to our status quo existence and then to go need to consume some more hero stuff. I mean, think of the prevalence of the Navy SEAL culture now in civilian culture. Guys like me and many others love just consuming those stories because it's stories of real life heroism and hardship and trial. And we get a little hit of the effect of that adventure without ever having actually had the adventure ourselves. And I think part of what you and I want to do is to ask people to consider what adventures might be in front of them and how could they summon the courage to begin moving forward in that adventure. So you're not consuming someone else's story and, sort of parasitically, and I don't mean that overly negatively because we all love a good story, but to the degree that adventure is missing in your own life, how can you stop borrowing other people's parasitically and begin living your own? And this isn't only for our own enjoyment. I mean, there's plenty of enjoyment. Well, let's see, capital E enjoyment in the fullest sense, because it's not always fun, but it is satisfying. So we get that benefit, but we also then contribute to the world in the ways that we are uniquely made to contribute. And I think that's one of the paths toward healing more substantially ourselves individually, healing our cities, healing our states, our nation, our world, is when each of us is assuming more complete responsibility for living out the best possible adventure we can with our lives.
Yeah. The Bible is just a classic storybook. Even if you don't believe it's inspired, I mean, it's filled with individual characters and the adventures and journeys of their lives. And one of the things that I realized as I've kind of reflected on it is that all the best stuff in the Bible, all the best stories, all the transformation, all the miracles, they all take place in that special world. The phrase I use is in liminality. The limens in Latin just means a threshold. So once you cross over the threshold and go out onto the journey, that's where the good stuff takes place. And that's true in Star Wars. Luke Skywalker has to leave his home and Harry Potter has to go to Hogwarts. And, every epic hero's journey you think about, all the great stuff happens when they're out there on the quest. And yet so much of our American consumeristic kind of middle-class life is about comfort and safety and security and not having to cross out into that threshold space, that liminality. And then we wonder, why are we dying? And why are we not happy? And in many ways, I think our misery comes from a lack of meaning. It doesn't come from a lack of resources. It comes from a lack of meaning, which, ultimately is really what each of us is longing for.
It's like, the Fellowship of the Ring took off on their journey and stopped in at the pub for refreshments, but stayed at the pub.
Yeah, that's right.
And didn't continue on. They kind of started a little bit, and then they just stayed in the place of comfort and enjoyment.
Yeah. The other image that comes to my mind is, I think it's the movie WALL-E, where, WALL-E is the robot up in space whose job it is to kind of care for humans. And there's that scene where all those big bloated characters are, basically sipping sustenance from straws and watching screens, and they're being moved around. They don't even have to walk. They're just being moved around on rolling vehicles. And the movie is not about those people, because that's not inspiring. The movie is about this little robot who goes off on an adventure and finds love and hardship and sacrifice. But nobody wants to watch a movie about a bunch of fat people, who are fed and, well cared for and just entertained all day. And yet that's what we often become ourselves if we're not careful.
Yeah, I don't think we can stress it enough. I mean, neither of us are psychologists or sons of psychologists or sociologists, but it just is so self-evident to me that part of what ails us in the U.S. and in modern Western culture these days is that stagnation, that lack of a clear adventure, a clear call to adventure, the courage to go out on those adventures. We desperately need it. It's a big deal. I think we're beginning to get at, from your story and a little bit of mine, how the hero's journey has been useful to us, both as a tool to gain clarity by way of hindsight and one to begin using now. But, for all of us, for those listening, and as we continue to deploy this principle in our own lives, how do we use it in our own lives? If I wanted to use this as a compass for navigating forward, what does it look like to do that?
Well, I think like any compass or map, first of all, it gives us a direction to move in. It gives us a path to take that says that even if we feel lost, we know there are beats on this story, there are steps on this journey that we can lean into. That, for instance, the cave that we fear, that we want to run from, is actually the thing we have to head towards. We can't go around it. That there is, if it feels like death, it's actually maybe not the thing to avoid, but the experience to lean into. It probably won't literally kill us, but there might be a part of us that needs to die in order for us to experience transformation. So I think it gives us, the compass analogy, it gives us an orientation to lean into adventure, to keep pressing on, and to make sure that we don't kind of lose heart along the way. But I think the other thing it does is it tells us the resources that we need on our journey. For instance, we need a mentor. We need someone in our life who can speak courage into us. We need someone who is there to make sure that we don't bail on a good intention, or that we don't, kind of flake out on something we feel like we should be doing. We need allies. We need those friends who will go on the journey. And that's what R2, D2, and C3PO are. In some ways, they become these allies who go along with Luke Skywalker on his journey and give him a sense of community so he's not all alone. And then I think ultimately we need to recognize that each of us has some sort of a prize that we're called to obtain, that is not just about us obtaining it, but it's about us offering it to the world around us. So what is that prize that you feel called to? Is it, for instance, I'll tell you, in my life, I grew up with 6 parents because of my parents being married and then divorced and remarried. And so for me early on, one of the prizes that I wanted to attain was to have one wife for my entire life and have kids who could grow up in a stable family environment, right? And so that's a prize that I've been leaning into my entire life. And now I kind of realize, man, part of that prize that I want to achieve is only achieved by going on this journey and facing my own inner demons and facing childhood patterns that I took on and trauma and pain that were part of my past, and not avoiding them, but leaning into them and naming them and actually kind of trying to slay them, so to speak. And that the every day for me when I'm in marriage, it's part of an adventure to be willing to, die to myself and serve and try to save, so to speak, the community around me, even if it's at my own expense. But that's the thing I want most in life. What I don't want is to become someone who, simply settles for my own comfort, and then at the end of my life doesn't have this prize to offer, which I think would be, kind of a new generational story for my kids to live into.
That's a beautiful example. And part of what I love about that example is that as you and your family do the hard work, slay the dragons to get the gold behind the dragon in order to stay together, your togetherness, the unity that you experience as a family, has an effect upon everyone you know. There's no doubt that the brokenness of families is one of the gravest cancers facing our culture and the world. And when you look back on your story, sort of a hero's journey that you had to go on in your early years, where you had 6 parents and you suffered trials and tribulations as a result of a story you had to go along with, that bore the fruit in your life of wanting to go on a particular type of adventure where that didn't happen. And now you're doing the hard work day by day to make the reality of that adventure become true. And you're healing not only yourselves, but you have a healing influence upon all around you. We all need a bigger why than just our own happiness. I mean, I think anytime our own happiness is our God, then misery is the result of one form or another. Whether it's misery in the form of chronic depression, anxiety, and inferiority complex, that's one form of misery, or miseries of a more overt and destructive sort that harms other people in even physical ways. Whenever just our happiness is God, misery is the result. And so we need a bigger why. And that's part of why I think these stories resonate, is because these heroes, as you've said, are in service of a greater purpose. Whether it's the ring to Mordor or defeating Darth Vader, they're in service of greater purpose. And by the way, one other thought before you pick up again, it just came to me as you were talking how in Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, the mentor who dies always returns in some sort of apparitional form just when the hero needs them most. I mean, like, the hero can't go on.
Yeah, that's right.
And suddenly Yoda shows up, and I don't remember what movie it was, but somehow gives, again, Luke the nugget of wisdom and courage that he needed to keep going. And
yeah,
I don't know. I think that's cool.
Yeah, there's a sense in which those voices, that impact always stays with you, and that's what the storyteller is trying to capture, that, the great scene at the end. I think it's even at the end of Return of the Jedi, where Luke looks off and sees Obi-Wan Kenobi and, Yoda sitting there, like, proud of him. Like, they're affirming the change that's been made in him, Yeah, that idea of seeking happiness for happiness' sake and how miserable that ultimately will make you reminds me of, one of the sayings of Jesus, who said, if you try to save your life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life, you will save it. And what he's basically saying is, if you become the center of your life, you'll be miserable. But if you put others at the center, you'll actually have purpose. Again, I really believe there's spiritual truth that's been embedded in this hero's journey story. And that's part of why it resonates so much across so many different cultures, because it speaks to the deep human nature and the longings that we have, regardless of what culture you're from.
And it's so gratifying to be able to look back and realize you've just gone on a hero's journey and you have returned. I mean, just so deeply whole person gratifying. The hero's journey I've gone on in the past 10 years to begin doing the work that I'm doing now, where I get to serve people on a one-on-one capacity in the graveyard groups and through the podcast. It is so gratifying when you realize that the work that I did has now been able to be invested into someone else, and it has actually changed their life. I mean, I go walk away from some graveyard group meetings and I just shake my head. I'm like, that was fantastic. I could do that all day long, every day, and it would never get old. And part of the satisfaction is knowing that that impact is rippling out into, sort of literally eternity through those guys and those gals' lives as they then move forward and transform themselves further. It's so gratifying. It's just the other gratifications that we seek so pale in comparison. And I'm not picking out my line of work in particular. I'm saying anytime we have decided to go on an adventure, we've reaped the reward, we've slayed the dragon and gotten the treasure, then we come back and we find that it's useful to others. I think that's part of why we see, if you have a cancer battle or a loved one has a cancer battle and it profoundly changes you, and then you become someone who's deeply involved in helping others with cancer through their suffering or through research, whatever, our story and our purpose in the world are inseparable. And so for people out there who are wondering about their purpose, and I think there's a lot of people doing that these days, especially probably in the 20s and 30-year-old range, look no further than your own story so far to begin understanding your purpose. And then with tools like the hero's journey as a compass, become more responsibly involved in creating the kind of story that you want so that you can continue to discover and deploy your purpose.
And you and I have used this phrase a lot, that one of the greatest killers in our own sense of purpose is victimization, to become a victim to our circumstances, to let life happen to us, right? And part of what makes the hero so clearly the hero are the assertive action steps that he or she takes to move forward. And so, I think that this framework is a good way to constantly be looking at my own life and saying, am I the hero or am I the victim of my story? That doesn't mean, again, heroes sacrifice for the benefit of others. That being a hero of my story doesn't make me selfish. It doesn't make me grandiose. It just means that I am empowered to take actions that are telling a story that I'm proud of and that I want to live, versus the victim who is not at the center of the story and has things happen to him or her and ultimately has no real sense of agency. It's sad as it is. There are a lot of people who go through life feeling like a victim. I was sharing with you that in this new season of Black Mirror on Netflix, the entire first episode is based on a woman who says to her therapist, I don't feel like the main character in my own life. And I just like, oh my gosh, I got to tell Petty, this is exactly what we've been talking about in coaching people, is how do you reassert yourself as the main character of your own life? Again, that doesn't mean you become selfish, because the hero ultimately sacrifices for the benefit of others. But the hero has that sense of agency that my choices are mine. I take responsibility for them, and I have people around me who can help me, like mentors and allies, become the empowered, action-taking person that I want to be.
There's no such thing as an inconsequential human or a human without impact. Nothing would be less enjoyable than going to a movie and realizing that a character has been casted as the hero, and that character either does nothing or goes the opposite direction of a hero. Shies away from every adventure, is always looking out for his own interests. And the movie wouldn't make sense. I mean, we would internally rebel against that idea. And yet many of us find ourselves stuck in a place where we recognize on some level, man, I probably ought to be doing differently, but I'm not. Maybe I could step forward with courage into that thing, but I'm not, for a variety of reasons that feel very valid and sometimes are. But the more we do that, the more we seal our own fate in terms of depression, anxiety, meaningless, purposelessness. And so we just can't overstate the value of understanding that the way forward is toward purpose, meaning, happiness, contentment, all those kinds of things, is through this adventure, which has trials and tribulations and hardships along the way. But what better adventure than to discover within yourself things that you never knew before? Some of them unpleasant, you overcome those. Some of them really wonderful to know. And then you continue to become the person you were made to be and continue to live the life you were made to live. Because, Jon, you and I both believe that there's design behind us, and we are made to live certain kinds of lives. And the kinds of lives we're made to live and the kinds of people we're made to be are knowable. And it's time for more of us to begin going on that adventure of discovering who we were made to be and what we were made to do in the world.
And of course, the irony in my life, and I know you resonate with this, is that of all the mythology of all the characters from, the global cultures, Jesus is one of them that Joseph Campbell talks about. He talks about, Jesus as the story of Jesus leaving the ordinary world of heaven, coming into the special world of earth, serving, sacrificing, having 12 disciples as allies, having an enemy that he faces, ultimately, facing his cave of death, being buried in a cave after his crucifixion, and then resurrecting and having now a gift of salvation to offer the world, where he then ascends ultimately up into heaven. And so, this idea of wanting to be someone who lives an adventure is part of me as a follower of Jesus, going, this is the life of Jesus that he lived, and I want to live as well. It's a life of courage, but also a life of sacrificing for the benefit of others.
That's awesome. I love the story of Jonah too. It's such a simple picture of this idea, but it also brings out another principle, because in Scripture, Jonah is asked by God to go preach to some foreigners who he doesn't particularly care for, and they're living wild, quote, ungodly lives. And God says, you're the guy to go tell them that they need to shape up. Jonah's like, no, thank you. And he books passage on a ship in the opposite direction. And then a storm besets the ship, and the sailors realize that somebody on the boat has probably angered God or done something wrong. And Jonah, eventually it's discovered. Does Jonah say that he did it, or they discover it through lots or something? I don't know.
Yeah, he admits. He's like, it's me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, he's like, it's me. So they chuck him over the side. The storm calms, and then Jonah's swallowed by this massive fish. He's literally sort of in a figurative hell of sorts. Then he's spit back out on the beach. And after all of this, he realizes, man, it is really foolish to attempt to not respond to the call to adventure that's been given to me. And I see this time and time again. I've seen it in my own life. I see it in clients that I work with. When we persist in a path or in a journey that isn't ours and demand that it's ours, whether that's a path of complacency or a path of, very often we bring into adulthood stories about what it looks like to be a worthwhile human. Like, you get a white collar job in this industry, and you get education from these schools. That would be a very classic one. And then in your 40s, you wake up in your corner office on the 70th floor and you go, I hate this. I hate this. And so we persist in stories that aren't our own, despite all of the evidence, whether it's just internal evidence like depression, anxiety, and anger and all those kinds of things, because we believe that it's our story. But eventually, if we're on a story that isn't ours, much like Jonah, I believe we get spit out of that story. It will not tolerate us. And that was true in my own life. I've seen it in many of my clients' lives. Sometimes we hold on to those stories because we think there's some security there that's important for us to have. The irony of it is the cost of that quote unquote security is just unbelievably high in terms of our own experience of life and ourselves and our relationships. Imagine if I'm living a story that's not mine and I'm angry and irritated every time I come home, what kind of family life do I have? What is my relationship with substances? What is my relationship with addictive behaviors that destroy relationships? So I really have seen and believe that when we persist in a story that's not ours, eventually it spits it out. Like Jonah got thrown over that ship and the whale spit him out. It's better, really, if we find ourselves with any inkling of an idea that we're living a story that's not ours, and there's a call to adventure that we haven't yet responded to just pause and to begin to really consider that. Spare yourself and those that you love any more pain, and begin to ask, what might my adventure be if this isn't the one? And then be willing to move forward on it before you get spit out. I mean, that's one way to do it. You can get spit out, and that's very, very similar to what happened to me actually in the first chapter professionally. Is I persisted until I got spit out. And then the cost of making the changes, I mean, it was a much more difficult process than it needed to be had I just at some point gone, yeah, this isn't me. I'm going to go do something else. Thanks. And Jon, that's one of the things that I always appreciated and admired about you, is because I think you had the wherewithal and the courage along the way to acknowledge that you were on an adventure that no longer was yours, and to make the change to respond to an adventure that called to you even more and that you felt like was yours. And you've always been a great example to me of that.
Yeah. And the beauty is, I may have chosen to get out, you may have been spit out, but the redemptive part of the journey we're all on is, I love that our lives have reconnected and that so many of the lessons that we learned, are aligning and the ways that we're working together, so there is no mistake that is, that we can't recover from. And you see that as well on these journeys, that there are times in which the hero shirks his responsibility and fails initially and then has to come back and, the second time man up or face the fear that they gave into, so whatever that is, that's one of the things I love about kind of our path, that we've had different paths, so to speak, but that our friendship and support of each other has brought us into saying, how do we help others now? I almost feel like we have a whole day's worth of content that we could explore in this area and try to help others with.
That's a great idea, Jon. Nice segue. Wow. Before we do that, we will do that momentarily. We'll talk about an event we have coming up that'll be based off of this idea. Are there any other key transferable principles that you think are important for our listener to hear today around the hero's journey before we move on?
Yeah, a couple themes maybe. The role that suffering plays in our life, which, again, most Eastern and Western religions have talked about embracing suffering as a path of purification. But I think so much of our American life today teaches us to avoid suffering, to numb suffering, to medicate suffering. Learning to, whether it's grief or loss or some sort of pain, adversity, to lean into that and to lean into it in a loving and safe community, to go through it. All these heroes have to face some level of suffering, and we appreciate their courage to do so. And we recognize that suffering is often part of what refines them. Because the whole concept of the hero's journey, as you watch it on TV, or in a movie, it seems very external, right? It's the road to Mordor. But what we really connect with is the internal journey of character transformation that they're going through. It's not just that he puts a ring in the fire. It's that, this little boy grows up in front of our own very eyes and becomes a brave hero that he didn't think he was at the beginning. That's what our souls connect with. We don't know what it looks like to put a ring in a fire on a mountain necessarily. But what we want is to grow up in areas of our life where we feel like we are either immature or underformed. And so suffering is often, the path to doing that rather than avoidance. And then I just think, the language of allies, rather than just friends, the language of allies has been so significant to me. I love kind of saying to someone, hey, in your journey, who are the allies? Who are the people that have covenanted with you, that have put their name kind of in blood to say, man, if you die, I die. If you try to climb the mountain, I will climb the mountain, and having a few of those, which every hero has, to make sure that you're not all alone. Because I think without those allies, most of these stories would be very different. I mean, the hero would at some point turn back and say, you know what, this is ridiculous. Like you said, I'll just sit in this pub and drink until this idea goes away, and then I can go back to my normal life. But it's those allies that give each other the steel and the resolve, the moments when Samwise Gamgee, gives Frodo that courage and gives him that incredible pep talk on the side of the mountain. That's the stuff that for me is just like, if I don't have those people in my life, then I'm lost, because I know I won't make it. And so, I think for each person to kind of think, who are the allies? And if I don't have them, how do I go intentionally seek them, inform them, and maybe be that for someone else first, so that person will then become it for me.
Coaches like me and Jon can be those allies. I have clients that I work with who use me for specific sort of time-based needs, and then they sort of resolve that and move on. I have people for whom people like me and Jon are just trusted partners in the journey. They enlist for longer term than that. It's part of the team that they enlist to navigate the world even more efficiently and effectively and enjoyably and productively. And often having someone like me and Jon in your world is an important and smart thing to do, because friends of the normal sort, as awesome as they are, it's complicated, because there's sometimes, if they were to say the hard thing, they might feel some threat to the relationship. And so they hold back on the hard thing, but it's precisely the thing you need to hear. So I encourage you, as you consider who your allies are, who your team is, to encourage you to have a mix of, maybe close family, a close friend or two, and also someone who is on your payroll to do and say sometimes the hard things that need to be done and said, to be more of a Gandalf than, who were the elves, Pippin or Peregrine, like
Peregrine, yeah.
They were a lot of fun, but they weren't often a whole lot of help.
Yeah, that's true.
So consider who your team is, because we all need a team. And you can get really intentional about assembling the kind of team that you believe you need. For me right now, my team consists of chiefly my wife, who's the wisest person in my life and my best coach, my coach, Jon, is part of my team. I've got a marketing guy who I work closely with who's part of my team. My therapist is part of my team. I have a tight-knit group of people who I lean on in different ways at different times and who thankfully are willing to, reciprocate by investing in me very well. And it's a wonderful feeling of safety too, to know that I don't have to figure it all out myself or be everything all the time. And to know too that there are people around me who would be willing to tell me if I'm being a dumbass or I'm blowing smoke or I'm just wimping out, or even to tell me, hey, Petty, you're pushing too hard. It's time for a break. Take a break, go on a vacation. Then you can resume the journey. So that's a great word. Enlist your team. Let's segue, Jon, as you began to, into kind of what this is all meant to help people appreciate and provide a teaser for, which is an event that you and I are putting on together. It's the first Andrew Petty coaching event for our community and anyone that wants to come from outside of the community. We're still working on the title. We found the title to be one of the hardest things to come up with, but it's something around the hero's journey and how the path to adventure is the way to find our purpose in life. So it's that idea. And much of what we taught today, we'll talk about at greater length in this event on October 14th here in Steamboat. We'll be at Steamboat Social Club, which is a cool new venue that some great guys have gotten spun up. That's both a co-working space and an event venue right here in the heart of downtown Steamboat. Jon's coming in and he'll be presenting the hero's journey as our guy from out of town with a briefcase, the expert. And then he and I will be tag teaming the content. The objective of that day really is to give you a deeper understanding of the hero's journey, how it can be a tool for you moving forward, and also for interpreting your story that you've lived so far so you can interpret it even more clearly. And then in small groups and in dyads, over the course of the day, we will help you learn how to deploy that in your life right now so that when you leave that day, you will have a transformational set of resources. You'll be better provisioned to move forward into your story with greater purpose, guts, gusto, and abandon for much more enjoyment, satisfaction, and productivity in your life. So we're really excited about it. It's the first Andrew Petty coaching event of this sort. We're working really hard on it and look forward to a great experience and be able to serve a lot of you. More details to come as I get registration, all that stuff sorted out. A lot of details to cover. But Jon will be in town for that. Really looking forward to doing that. It'll be an in-person event. Anything else you'd like to offer, Jon, just on helping people understand what that'll be about?
No, I think, the challenge of what we're doing today is you and I are having a conversation and our listener is just listening. What I think we're really excited about doing on that day is, engaging in some personal reflection, some personal experiences, some conversations, so that each person who's there can find themselves on this journey, can flesh out what this kind of looks like, and maybe identifies a prize that they want to seek or a problem that they want to address or a path ahead of them that they want to pursue more, with more vigor, and making sure that they walk away with that kind of personal action plan that they can take, and knowing that they're now not alone. They're part of a community of people who all want to live as heroes of their own story, who want to sacrifice for the benefit of others and want to have a gift that they can give to the world around them.
Jon, this conversation has been a blast. I love just learning together in real time as we talk through these things. I always marvel at your brain, your ability to present concepts in a linear, efficient, and effective fashion and march toward the objective. It just blows me away because my brain is just rabbit trailing all over the place. But together, we're probably a good combo in that regard. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for being a great partner and just a providential and serendipitous new arrival back into my story. And it's going to be a blast in October. Everyone out there, as always, remember, you are going to die, but you're not dead yet. So wake up and get after it. Thanks, Jon.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me.
Let's use the 10-second rule that Jon mentioned right here and right now, before another moment passes. What insight or idea grabbed you from this conversation? What's one step you could take today to apply action to that insight or idea, no matter how small, so that it can exert its influence in the real world and begin to reveal its value? Whatever that step is, summon the courage right now to take it. Accept the call to adventure and see where it takes you. Keep your eyes and ears open for more details about our one-day Hero's Journey event on October 14th here in Steamboat Springs. If today's episode has sparked something inside of you, then that event might be just the thing to propel you forward on your next great adventure. In the meantime, how can I help you become who you were made to be and live the life you were made to live? Find me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Andrew Petty Coach, at andrewpettycoach.com, or email me at andrew@andrewpettycoach.com. Thank you once again for your time and attention. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow this show and share it with your friends. And I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.